Hello, everyone. For this video, I am joined by the amazing writer and human being, Shara McCallum. We're going to be talking about her latest book, No Ruined Stone. First off, Shara, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here, Phil. Thank you for asking.
All right. From Jamaica and born to a Jamaican father and Venezuelan mother, Shara McCallum has published 6 books in the US and UK, including her most recent, No Ruined Stone, winner of the 2022 Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Poetry. An anthology of her poems translated into Spanish by Adalbert Salas Hernandez, La Historia es un cuarto, was published in 2021 in Mexico. McCallum is an Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of English at Penn State University, is on the faculty of the Pacific University Low Residency MFA, and served as the 2021-22 Penn State Laureate. She is a 2023 Guggenheim Fellow. For a longer bio and further information, you can visit her website, www.sharamccallum.com. There will be a link to that in the description below. So, to start out, Shara, can you just give us sort of a brief overview of No Ruined Stone?
So the book is a novel in verse. And so what that means is that it acts as a novel across the poems, but it is in poetry that I'm responding to a true story of the 18th century Scottish poet Robert Burns, who almost went to Jamaica to work on a slave plantation. And the book answers the question, what would have happened had he gone? So it's a speculative account of history offered through a series of poems that are lyric and dramatic monologues.
Okay. So Burns is one of the primary characters, definitely not the only major character, but he is the major character that most people will know about. So,
right.
So I know that we're both fans of Scottish literature and culture, but why Burns? Why this particular poet as opposed to, say, a Wordsworth or a Keats or a Dickinson?
Well, I mean, I think it's partly the happenstance of how I came to know this story, as well as its intersection with my own history as a reader, but also my biography. So for one reason it interested me is because I didn't imagine that the poet I knew through the poems would have gone to work in the capacity Burns had agreed to go and contracted himself to go as, which is to say a bookkeeper, which is really a misnomer. He would have had the work of overseeing enslaved Africans. So one of the reasons is there was a disjuncture between the idea of Burns that I felt I knew through the poems and this fact of his actual life that I came into contact with. I say I came into contact with it because it was my first visit to Scotland, and I learned it somewhat accidentally. And I think that kind of love of Burns and his poetry, combined with my own ancestry, kind of struck a chord with me. So as a poet, there was that, but then also my surname is McCallum. My surname is patrilineal, and my father's father was a Black Jamaican. So I think it also struck this chord in me because I am, long time interested in the kind of intersection of different kinds of histories with individual experiences. Certainly the legacy of colonialism and slavery, which this book is dealing with, something I have dealt with in my life, thought about, written about prior. So I think it's all of those things coming together, why it had to be Burns.
Okay. So you had talked about coming to know Burns through his poetry.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit maybe about Burns's influence on you as a poet? I know influence questions are often quite fraught, but...
No, it's fine. I mean, I think I have many influences. I have many inheritances as a poet, and certainly Burns is one of them. More broadly, the British Romantic poets And Burns is one of those, less studied because we tend to study the English, not the Scottish Romantic poets. But I had studied a little bit of Burns's work as an undergraduate. And so really it's through poems like particularly Ode to a Mouse that I had come to know Burns. It's a well-known poem. Many people know some of the very oft-quoted lines, even if they don't know the whole of the poem. The best laid schemes of mice and men, etc. So I think it was that idea of the Romantic period writ large, which I was very attracted to as a young reader of poetry, even before I thought I would be a writer of it. This idea of human life mattering, it was a quite revolutionary moment, even if its vision of humans was obviously quite incomplete. The ideal of Romantic thought is what I was hearing and hearing as the voice that I felt I knew as the poet Burns. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think probably a lot of people who love poetry will probably have a similar kind of experience to that, right? The Romantics and the Beats, I think, are kind of the great poets of literary people's teenage years in some ways.
Right. Right.
And then as you grow, you find new things to love about them.
Right.
So one of the things that I was really struck by with this book, if we take it more specifically back here, Burns is generally, and I don't think this would be shocking to most people, given what you've just said, Burns is generally presented quite sympathetically or empathetically, despite the role that he plays in this sort of alternate history timeline where he goes and works basically as a slaver in Jamaica. And it seems to me that tone, that sort of empathetic approach to him in that position raises some interesting potential problems, both in terms of sort of slavery's ongoing legacy in Jamaica, in the Western Hemisphere more broadly, but also given your own personal ancestry and your own personal poetic and literary commitments. And you talk a little bit about that tension in the author's note at the end of the book, but I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on what, I don't know, I guess maybe what it takes or what it means to present sympathetically someone who is a beloved figure, but is imagined doing something horrific.
Right. I think I have so many different answers to this question, Phil, that I'll try to be, succinct. But I think one of the first things I would say is that he's not the only speaker in the book. So, right. So he's half of the book, but then his granddaughter is the one who has the last say, and she comes after him. And in many ways, I think if you read the book start to finish, which is what I would hope, you would get a more complicated sense of how Burns is being presented. Because Isabella calls into question all of these questions you're asking. How could you only think of your own suffering in the context of the suffering of my grandmother and my mother? And, that's one of her main questions for Burns, which is really one of the questions of history. And my question as the poet, how do I reconcile that incomplete vision that we were speaking of, that I heard this kind of beautiful voice that was espousing liberty, and then I had to understand that liberty didn't include me, right? So that is one answer I would give, is that there's a bigger book in which Burns is one speaker and one character. It's also worth noting that I'm speaking in his voice. And so when you're working with the dramatic monologue, the vantage point is necessarily limited. So Burns's point of view is going to be Burns's point of view. What I trust is that there are multiple resonances that will engender, because we are reading Burns from a different vantage point. So in a sense, I'm putting in his mouth words that I know will signal his true feeling of loss. He feels very much in the context that I put him in, that he is not capable of being this great man that he really does want to be. And in his own life, if I could for a minute just speak to that, the same exact reckoning was there too. It just wasn't in the context of slavery, by the way. Didn't deal with that, but he was an exciseman, which meant he was a tax collector for the crown, and he espoused pretty Republican beliefs in terms of, his poems and his songs. So there was that tension in Burns's own life that I made manifest in the character and worsened it by putting it in the context of slavery. So I'm aware of doing all of those things as the writer. And what I also am trusting is a tool that we have as writers, which is dramatic irony, which is that the audience knows something that the character doesn't know, right? So Burns doesn't know what is going to happen to his daughter or to Isabella. He doesn't know that he's going to be famous in my narrative after he dies. He doesn't know any of those things. He doesn't know that, slavery will end, but also how he will be read in the context of history. But we know that. We know a lot more. So I think that there's hopefully, I want to have my cake and eat it, which is true of most writers. I want him to be a character. I want him to feel real. And I have to have a vantage point that is his. And at the same time, I'm not losing sight, I hope, of the larger projects, interrogations of history, and particularly the legacy of slavery and colonization. I would have to hope that nobody would miss what the book is doing in that regard. And the last thing I would just say is that it's not that interesting to write a book that says this is, slavery is bad. Like, that is an obvious starting point. That is not an ending point, right? To me, or that slavery is a violent institution is true. So if that needs to be spelled out, then I'm not really sure that I'm writing with that particular person in mind, because that is an obvious truth from which I commence this book, in other words, right? And it would feel very reductive to use Burns as a prop to demonstrate what to me is an already won argument. Yeah,
I think that all makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that came up a few times in your answer there is that in order to really appreciate what the book is doing, you need to think about both halves of it, because the halves complement one another. So I want to sort of take us into that second half now, where we move really away from Burns and his perspective, and we move to Isabella.
Right.
Can you sort of briefly talk us through who Isabella is?
Sure. Well, she has a genealogical chart between the sections, because I'm aware that there's a lot of characters to track in poems that are pretty spare. Isabella is Burns' granddaughter, and yes, there is that chart. Burns has a multi-year relationship with an enslaved African woman named Nancy in my narrative. I gave her that name because that is the name of Burns' in his most famous song, his love song, A Fond Kiss. Nancy is the name of the beloved. So I imagined if he had gone to Jamaica, he would never have met Agnes McCallum, who is the Nancy of A Fond Kiss by all biographical accounts. Yeah. So the Nancy he meets instead is an enslaved African woman. And in Burns' imagination, he loves her, and they have a child. And that child grows up enslaved on the plantation. Burns dies 10 years in. So he doesn't know what happens to his child. What he knows when his part of the book ends is that he's failed as a man to be able to free his child, save Nancy. Like, he is powerless himself in the institution of slavery as it's constructed, because Douglas, who is the owner of the plantation, owns his paramour, Nancy, and his child, Burns and Nancy's child. So all of that happens in the first half. When Isabella's section opens, we switch to Scotland, different location, different time period, and she is 19 years old. She's come of age in Scotland. She migrates because her mother dies in slavery. It's worth noting her mother is raped by Douglas. So both Isabella's father and her grandfather are white Scotsmen. Her mother is a mixed race product of Burns and Nancy. A story that is fairly common in terms of the annals of slavery, but I can't find any literary antecedents easily available. So in a way, Isabella is my desire to give a character, a narrative, and a story to a voice that I hear and know would have existed in that time period. So that's a lot of explanation of why Isabella comes into being, but also who she is. She's a mixed race Black woman born into slavery who looks white and is passing for white in the second half of the book. And she's Burns' granddaughter.
Okay. That's actually great, because I think you've sort of really well set the stage for the next question.
Good.
So one thing that I think is really interesting with Isabella is that, like Burns, she is displaced from her home, but she goes the opposite direction that he goes. He goes from Scotland to Jamaica, and she goes from Jamaica to Scotland. But her experience of being expatriated is quite different than his experience.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about some of the differences between their experiences and why those differences are significant?
So, I mean, one of them is that she's a woman, right? So right away, she's constructed differently in terms of access to power. Her power is attached to her husband, and he does not know that she is passing for white. So that's part of the precarity that exists for Isabella, that is a product of both being born enslaved, being Black, and being a woman as well. In that time period, women are property of their husbands or of their fathers before that, and she is without acknowledgement on her father's side, because Douglas gets rid of her as the narrative unfolds. You realize he's sort of paid off not to have to see her. And that's just one of the profound ironies of genetics, is that Isabella just happens to look like his mother, right? Which can happen, and he doesn't want to have to look at that every day. So in a way, that's the only explanation that's given for why Douglas is a monster, really, in this narrative. Why would he allow Nancy and Isabella to go? That's the only contextual answer I provide. And so her circumstances are just way more precarious as a consequence of passing. Also, she doesn't know what will happen to her if she decides she can no longer pass, which is one of Isabella's great struggles, is she does not want to continue to live a life that she feels is a lie. She also is pregnant by the end of that section. And so there's great anxiety that comes with pregnancy for her, because she feels she must either tell her husband or take a gamble for what her child will look like. So there's a lot of, I think, differences that have everything to do with gender, race. Also, slavery is ongoing when Isabella is coming of age. And it doesn't end until 1833, but when she is speaking in the 1-year time frame of her narrative, she doesn't know that it's going to end. Again, dramatic irony, right? So even while slavery is not legal in Scotland at that point in time, she's still a slave. She's still owned by someone else, right? And so she's constantly aware that her grandmother has said, like, this is what's going to save you, basically, is this story that we've concocted. So I think those are a lot of differences that are degrees of precarity that she experiences that are fundamentally changing her relationship to Scotland. Whereas Burns, even though he's in Jamaica, he's always pining for Scotland, writing of Scotland. In some ways, Isabella's also lamenting her loss of Jamaica, but largely because of her grandmother. This is also, her grandmother has died, she's struggling with grief. So in a way, it's that she was known by somebody in this world as her full self, and that the only person was her grandmother, who's now gone. And so that's where she speaks of Jamaica, really, is in the context of there I was Nancy's child. I was part of kinship, which, if you know, we both know about Scotland and Jamaica similarly. Kinship is everything. And so not to be with that is to dislocate her in a way that Burns himself is not dislocated. He is never dislocated. He is a sojourner in the Scottish word for it. He's not even fully in exile in the same way, because there's this belief that you're just in this sojourn in this place, but your real home is back there. Whereas she doesn't have that. She has neither of those places, those groundings in what we might think of as national identity now, though at that time it's really not construed so clearly as such. She doesn't have that grounding in either Jamaica or Scotland. Her footing is very unstable.
Yeah. So I love that you introduced the idea of kinship and particularly matrilineal relationships, because those are really central to your poetry across all of the books that you publish. Can you talk maybe about the sort of importance of grandmother, mother, daughter relationships?
Well, I noticed after the fact,
this book and your larger body of work.
I noticed things after having written this book, which are obvious, I suppose, to anyone else. But when I'm in the middle of something, I'm not thinking that much about patterns necessarily. You're probably just making them intuitively as a writer. But clearly, I could see that this book follows a kind of pattern, if you will, where the mother dies. Agnes dies in childbirth, Isabella's mother, which echoes so many of the absent mothers, and the kind of the grandmother as a mother figure in this book is something that I have written about for a long time. In my own backstory, I migrated to the United States without my parents, with my grandmother. And my mother did come, but after a year's separation, and I still was primarily raised from that point on by my grandmother. And so I think that that's sort of a tension that exists in a lot of Caribbean literature, which is, I used to think about it this way, like, I don't know that I even could conceive of what a grandmother was, right? Like, I had friends who had grandmothers, but I had basically two kinds of mothers, like the role that both of those women played and play in my psyche, right? So and when I came upon the fact that in Iwe, like that lullaby that I rendered into English, and I found when I was searching for some African antecedents of cultural artifacts, which are much harder to find. They're less recorded. They're less existing in the archives than, Burns' papers. But I was just really looking for something, and I was just really grateful to find that lullaby, because Nana in Iwe means grandmother or mother. And again, that speaks volumes to some of the ways in which I think, certainly for African Jamaicans, grandmothers have played this kind of role of also being mothers. Not just in my life is this true, but this is really replete in much of Caribbean culture and history. And so it felt sort of like natural, I suppose, to give Isabella, to some extent, she doesn't have exactly my backstory, but to borrow from threads of my own experience. I'm also obviously writing about absent fathers, which is not a new topic for me. The fact that my mother did return, but my father died a few days after I migrated, it's a point of rupture that I return to from a emotional standpoint, if not always factual. Like I'm and absent countries, and so I can see obviously that I'm building off of threads of experience or themes, subjects that I have preoccupation with, I would say more so than just threads of experience at this point. Because there's many, many experiences I have as a human being, and I'm not as preoccupied to create patterns, or to keep going to those as a poet. So it's more poetic preoccupations than just strictly saying, oh, I'm borrowing from this, like, part of my biography in some one-to-one fashion. I don't think I'm doing that. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question. I can see that there are preoccupations here. Yeah.
So one of the other this is going to slightly take us in a different direction, but one of the other preoccupations maybe, or just recurring themes across your work and very, very common throughout the poems in this book is geography, particularly oceans and mountains. And I mean, that I think makes a lot of sense because you think Scotland, you think the Highlands, you think the Caribbean, you think ocean. But I mean, also in your other books of poetry, the ocean is a big thing. Often like streams are a big thing. Geography is another sort of recurring fascination. So can you talk a little bit about why geography is so central to this book?
I think it's maybe this would be a very difficult one for me to answer, but I would say it's sort of more like if I were a painter, what would I be interested in looking at and putting on the canvas? So I often am interested imagistically in reconstructing the world. And one of the images that keeps coming back is the image of the sea and of the mountains. And that is where I grew up. So Kingston is a harbor city, but in my backyard is, a 7,500-foot mountain that soars pretty fast out of the harbor. So you have a sense of scale that, is part of a landscape, I think, that you inherit early, that I think just inflects a lot of what I'm attracted to. When I went to Scotland and I did retrace Burns' life and detail, the only deviation I made was I went on to Skye, which he never actually got to. But Skye was absolutely a place that just spoke to me. And it is for this reason that when I'm proximate to places where there is water and there's the mountains, it feels like a kind of geographic grounding for me. Yeah. So I don't have answered why I'm doing it so much as I just keep being attracted to that sense of scale. And also it makes you feel so small as a human in the face of the vastness of the ocean and also a towering mountain. Like on some level, there's just a beautiful feeling of being eclipsed. To go back to the Romantics, it's where I feel the sublime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder if there's also an element of that concern in the collection about displacement and the experience of displacement, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Scotland and Jamaica, I think you'll agree with me on this. Scotland and Jamaica are not necessarily all that similar in terms of like climate and environment, but there are shared similarities. Like you said, Scotland is not a big country and it's surrounded by the ocean. Jamaica is not a big country and it's surrounded by the ocean. Both have mountains. So there are these similarities, but there are also significant differences, particularly in things like the weather.
Right.
So,
yes.
So I wonder.
It's a bit moodier, colder, windier. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I wonder if that sense of or that interest in geography kind of intersects with the interest in expatriation, and that sort of that sense of maybe being simultaneously reminded of home and of how far from home these characters are.
Yeah, very likely. I mean, I say that because, when we're having this conversation, it's a long time after having written these poems.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that everything I'm saying was, I know that everything I'm saying I wasn't thinking when I was writing. But it makes a lot of sense. And to some extent, it's just the practice of having written, and especially also having written. That is why I feel like, I could say very likely that's impactful in terms of thinking through why geography plays the role it does. In terms of literature, why it plays the role it does, right? It's a signifier for us. I don't know, I cannot look at the land and not see the history that it, is coursing through the rivers and streams and I think that may just be a poetic sensibility, the desire to sort of see the thing, but then see what it also represents. And I like what you said, Phil, about I am reminded when I'm in Scotland that I feel a certain actually kinship with the language, the culture, and the place, and distance from it at the same time. Yeah. But there's something there that I recognize. And I didn't know that until I went there. And I didn't also know, it was almost like learning the story of Burns while I was learning Scotland, was recognizing how much of the history of Jamaica and Scotland and that relationship was not taught to me and isn't taught very much in Scotland. And yet is so clear, right? The amount of participation of Scots in Jamaican slavery, and the fact that I've often said, like, if you go to the Kingston phone book, there's more Campbells in it than there are in Scotland at this point. Like, there's such evidence there, and in the language, even sometimes the phrasing. One of the funny examples I've recounted many times is that when I was in Scotland and I kept hearing people say the word muckle, the first thought I had was, oh, we have a saying like that in Jamaica. I actually said this to this person who's Scottish, and they must have thought, boy, you are really dense. I was like, we say every mickle, mecca, muckle. And as soon as I said it, I realized every single word is Scots. That's not Jamaican. I learned it in Jamaica as a child, so I think that it's Jamaican. But clearly, every word, well, not every, but mickle, mek, muckle, like those are mickle, mek. These are Middle English, which is where Scots is coming from. So it just occurred to me as I was saying this really stupid thing about how Jamaican this Scottish thing is, that it was actually that was showing up this relationship that we're talking about. So it's a stretch. I mean, I'm not going to make an argument where there is none to be made. There are huge differences between Scotland and Jamaica. But what's interesting to me were the similarities.
Yeah. I think that's interesting because you probably don't know this play since you're not really a drama person primarily, but I had written a short paper a while back about Eileen Ritchie's play The Juju Girl, which confronts contemporary Scotland's sort of amnesia about the role that Scottish people played in British colonialism. And it's concerned about British colonialism in Africa, but I mean, in the Caribbean, in India, the same thing. I mean, no,
Tombstone is definitely part of that. It is a recognition of that amnesia, and it's an intervention into amnesia, if you will.
Yeah. I think that's actually a really great phrase to sort of sum up the book. So I think we'll kind of wrap up the interview there. Shara, thank you for joining me. This was an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for your wonderful questions and reading of the book so closely and thoughtfully.